All right.
And who's on our agenda next?
I think the next one is Chris. Yes. Hello, Chris.
Hi there.
Hello. So I actually ran into Chris when I was at the Ncrafts conference a couple of weeks back. I was like, this thing you're talking about, your sort of F# project to do domain-driven design, that sounds really interesting. I wonder if you'd like to join us at fsharpConf and talk about it.
Nice. So let's hear more.
Let's hear more.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. It was quite a surprise invitation. As you might be able to hear from my accent, I am from Australia. So I would normally have to wake up at about 2 o'clock in the morning to attend this kind of conference. But thankfully, right now, I'm traveling through Europe to speak at a few other conferences, including Domain-Driven Design Europe, which was on a couple of weeks ago. So this is very fortuitous timing, and I'm very pleased to be here to show off this tool. So yeah, I can see the screen is shared there, so thank you. I'm going to try today to do something a little bit interactive with the audience, and this is all going to be quasi-live coding. So if anyone would like to chime in with a comment to tell me about a domain that they are working in that they think is quite interesting and complex, and while I'm waiting for that comment, I'll go on and tell you a bit more about the background of this tool. So I'm going to be showing you this tool called Contextive. For 2 reasons. One, I think it's an interesting tool that might be of interest to some people, but also because I set out on a mission when building this tool to build the whole thing in F#. And when I say the whole thing, I mean a lot of different components that have to run in different places at different times. So I think there's some interesting elements to that. The origin of the tool came from using domain-driven design, which is a practice of analysis that I think pairs really well with the previous talk to help you do that sort of collaborative modeling with your domain experts and your stakeholders so that you can learn more about the domain as a developer. What I found was that you would do these sort of modeling activities at the start of a project, and then the team would change, people would join, people would leave. And even with the code being as readable as you might try and make it, there's always some essential knowledge about the domain that sometimes gets lost. And sometimes that's why things are the way they are, or some variations about how people talk about these things. So I had this idea of trying to build a tool that would help us document our domain models and our domain language in particular in a way that was quite, genuinely ubiquitous. And that term ubiquitous comes from the field of domain-driven design. And they talk about this thing called a ubiquitous language. So that's what I'm going to show you today. I'm not seeing anyone chiming in with an interesting domain in the comments there yet, so maybe I'll just pick one and run with it. Or maybe I can try and use Lars's domain. I do try and make this a bit sort of dynamic as we go. So apologies, Lars, if I get everything wrong with your domain, and certainly I'm going to be using English. Oh, here we go. David Neal has chimed in with call centers and phone calls. Great. So if you could, David, if you could add a few more comments about maybe some key terminology in that domain and define that terminology, and maybe give us some examples of sentences that people would use when using that terminology. Sorry, Casper, that is an interesting domain, but David got in first with call centers and phone calls. So David, if you could add some more comments with that, that'd be great. But while he's doing that, I'll show you. So the tool at the moment only works in VsCode, but it's been designed to work in other IDEs eventually. I will get to them soon, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But when you start with a fresh project, inside the palette, there's a contextive initialize definitions command. And when you start that, you get a definitions file. Now, the definitions file is kind of meta and self-referential in that the definitions in there help define the terms that are used in the definitions file itself, but it's a bit complex. So I'm going to skip that, and we'll start with something a bit more simple. So call centers and phone calls. I haven't got any more. I don't know if we're on a delay on the comments there, but I'll just start with making some things up, as all good programmers do when they don't understand the domain. So let's create a name call center. Or we might, that's going to be, let's just use center for now to keep it simple. So as soon as you define this term in this file, this tool acts as an assistant within your IDE. And when you hover over that term, you get a special tooltip that pops up and gives you the definition of it. And as you can see there, it's poking you in the ribs and saying, hang on, you haven't given me a definition yet, so it's explicitly undefined. So let's give it a definition and say, here we go. Oh, I've got some more comments from David now, so I might change that. So here we go, a campaign, that's a great one. So a campaign is a project to call many people and ask them to complete a survey. So now when we've got this definition, if I hover over the word campaign, we get that definition there. Now, this tool has been written deliberately to interact with the code the way a human does. It doesn't presume anything about your implementation. So if we have a campaign file, maybe as soon as we start typing it, we get that definition up there. So it kind of guides us in the autocomplete to use the domain terminology. But as we write a bit more of our code, we can get that terminology everywhere, and the definition pops up everywhere. Even in, if we maybe write a more technocratically oriented comment, we can get that definition in there, because it really is just trying to find just the words in the code. It's not looking at syntax, it's not looking at classes or properties or anything like that. And because of that, it also works in configuration files, as we saw in the YAML, and also in Markdown. And so we can get that there, and also autocomplete in the Markdown. So you can see that right there, right from the start, which I think is pretty cool and helpful in terms of trying to make sure that you're using the language that your domain experts speak, which is, to be honest, one of the central insights from the domain-driven design movement. The guy called Eric Evans started about 20 years ago. A bit more stuff that you can do with the tool. So we've got a definition of a term. One of the other insights from domain-driven design is that sometimes terms can be a bit confusing, because people, humans, when we communicate, we're very naturally context aware. And so we sometimes slip between definitions, and we use two different words for the same thing, or we use, the same term for two different things. So contexts, the concept of a context is really important here. We call it a bounded context, where we put a boundary around the definitions in the tool. So let's start with giving our context a name, and we call it the campaign context. And because this is YAML, I'm going to have to tweak this a little bit. And now if I hover over this, I get the definition that we're in the campaign context. We can also give it a domain vision statement, which gives us the purpose of this context. It might be a module, it might be a microservice. There's a lot of different ways that you can implement a bounded context in a system, depending on the language that you're using. But the vision statement kind of gives you the purpose of that context from a logical modeling perspective. So let's say the main vision statement of the campaign is to support staff in running phone call campaigns. So now when we hover over the word campaign, we get the campaign context and the vision and the definition of the campaign. I'm having a little bit of one of those moments when you have semantic satiation, and I'm looking at the word campaign so often I can't even tell if I'm spelling it right anymore, but hopefully this is all good. The other thing that is really, I think, powerful here is that you can add examples, and this is really the crux of the whole thing, is that we want to illustrate how people actually use these words, this key terminology, in actual sentences that they would explain. So you might have a sentence like, is the campaign running on schedule? Might be a sentence that a domain expert would use. So we're launching a new campaign next week. And so now you get these in the terminology pop up as well, usage examples. And I think that this is really important for helping developers understand the way domain experts talk about these domain terms, because so often, we kind of assume that we understand what it means, or we infer its meaning from our having seen that word in other situations or other contexts. And these examples give us a little bit more of a hint about what they're actually talking about. I see a question from Jimmy about, is there an aliases feature? And I'm so happy to say that as of literally last week, there is. It got added last week, doing live coding with the .NET London meetup. I added this feature and launched it to the marketplace during the meetup, which is kind of a thing I've started doing recently. I did it in a meetup in Sydney. We added support for pluralization at the meetup, and at the .NET London meetup, we added support for aliases and launched it. So maybe another term for a campaign might be a project. And so how that works now is if I hover over the word project, I still get the definition of campaign. It's just an MVP of this feature at the moment, but you can see here how by adding a number of aliases, even if you use the alias, maybe you've got some legacy code that you might have, so like get project name, equals something within the campaign module, it actually can still hover and find that. And this is another aspect of it, is that it splits the words based on camel case and underscore Pascal case and all sorts of things, and snake case, and still finds the terminology that's important. So it's split this, found the word project, identified that project is an alias of campaign, and giving you the definition of campaign while you're right there. Obviously, there's a lot more we can do with that to support progressive refactoring and alignment and terminology, and maybe to highlight in the pop-up that this is a stale term. There's some other pretty cool stuff that we can do, and I would love to demo it all to you, but I'm conscious of time, and there's some other things I wanted to show about this tool, specifically because this is fsharpConf, and I'm just talking about a generic programmer support tool that actually would work with any language, C#, Scala, Java, TypeScript, whatever you want, which I think is one of the strengths of it, because if you are using a polyglot environment, you can share these definitions across all of those environments and get access to the same documentation, whether you're talking about an F# file, or maybe someone is still doing a campaign component in TypeScript React, and maybe doing short function, and you still get exactly the same definition, which obviously you don't get if you're relying on language-specific documentation features. There's some other cool stuff about splitting your code into contexts and picking up the right definition when you're there, but we might skip on that because I want to jump ahead and show you a little bit about why I decided to use F# for this project. So let me find where I was going here. So this is a bit of a diagram of the architecture of Contextive as it currently stands. We've got the VsCode extension, and it's built using the language server protocol. So even though the LSP protocol was designed for supporting the rollout of particular languages into lots of different IDEs, it's perfectly serviceable for this application, even though we're not specifically talking about a programming language. So we've got the language server protocol server, we've got the VsCode extension so far. I haven't built these other extensions yet, but the purpose of the LSP server protocol, the LS language server protocol, is to support that. So we'll be doing that at some point. But I've got a much bigger vision for this tool, which is to actually add it into environments where you need to do knowledge sharing. So you can see here one about having a chat service or an adapter with Slack. So what I'm going to do actually now is show you what that looks like. I'm going to sync this definitions file up into a cloud server. Ooh, doesn't like this. I have not uploaded the support for aliases into the cloud server. So let's just get rid of those for the moment and sync that one up. Let's come back and confirm that it's scaled that. And if I go into Slack and say I'm working with my colleagues in Slack and they send me a message that says, have you added the new campaign support for rapid dialing, say, and they send you this message, Contextive is listening to these messages. And because it now knows the definition that the word campaign is a special word, if the demo gods are smiling on me, we will get a reply from Contextive, which just adds a little bit of a reminder to say, this is how we define the word campaign in this context. So if you might have a campaign management context, and separately you might have context for managing employee, something to do with employees or the people working in the campaign, or sales, or some other context to support different aspects of your business, the word campaign might have a subtly different definition there. And so we can tie a channel to a context, and we can say, in this context, this is the word, what the word campaign means. And although this is just a POC at the moment, this feature with the Slack integration is not live yet. I'm hopeful that we'll have the ability to propose updates to the definition so that your domain experts can propose these definitions, that you can see the usage examples. And if the term is used in other contexts, we can see how it's used in those other contexts. Importantly, I don't expect that anyone's going to want these reminders popping up every single time you use the word. So it'll remember that you've used it and not send you that reminder for the next 2 weeks. Trying to find the balance between making sure that the reminders pop in frequently enough that new members of the team aren't left in the dark about what people are talking about, but not so frequently that it gets annoying for the people that are quite familiar with the terminology. So, that's something to explore as we go. But what's pretty cool about this, I think, from an F# perspective, is that if I zoom out and so like the full vision of where this could go, a browser extension so that you can get this support when you're working in your wiki, or in your email, or maybe your support ticket system, some extensions in Office 365 or even Miro, to provide some support around that, and maybe even in the future some integration with some large language models to do things like proposing definitions or giving you some hints around whether a definition that you've currently got might be ambiguous or confusing. And the good thing, the reason I chose F# is if you look across this landscape, with a lot of different types of components running in different environments. We've got the VsCode extension, we've got a .NET extension in VS 2019. There's probably going to be a Java extension for the IntelliJ platform, but that'll probably be the only component that I won't be able to build in F#. Everything else, the language server, the Slack adapter, even the infrastructure as code is being built in F# with AWS CDK, the browser extension with Fable, and all these other components should be able to be done in F#. And I thought that was a pretty cool thing. If you want to read more about that, this is the GitHub for Contextive. In the docs ADR folder, I do have an architecture decision record capturing a lot of the key decisions I made, and the one around the language and framework selection goes into detail around the various languages that I considered, the various IDEs that I intended to support, the various execution environments that I needed to support, and the pros and cons of choosing F#. Now, if I'm 100% honest with you, my F# friends, this was all a post hoc justification for the fact that I actually just really wanted to build it in F#. So, but I think it stands on its own merits. So having done all of that sort of demoing, let's have a quick look at what it actually looks like. So if I jump over to the VsCode, there's a great question there, Matthias Branduano. Do you envisage a two-way mapping? You have this term in the domain, you see nothing in the code that seems to map. Where is it? That is an excellent question, and I have been pondering that. And I actually got a chance to talk about this with Eric Evans, who's the guy that wrote the original domain-driven design book at the conference a couple of weeks ago, and he had the same suggestion. So you are in good company with that one. So definitely we'll be looking at that. There's a question, how many contexts can be added without significantly affecting performance? I do not know. I haven't tried it with 1,000. That'll be one of those cross those bridges when I come to it moments. My expectation is, though, that typically once you have so many contexts, you're probably splitting these things into separate repositories, typically a repository per team. Hopefully you have a team aligned with a context. So ideally you would have just that context defined in that file in that repository. If you are adding multiple contexts to the same definitions file, that's typically when you are using a monorepo style, which I do actually quite like myself, but I know a lot of teams don't like it. But I think if you have 1,000 contexts, you probably have bigger problems than Contextive performance, if I'm honest, Vladimir. Casper's question, can Contextive reverse engineer from the code? Unfortunately not yet, but nothing to stop an enterprising contributor adding that. It is an open source project. It's certainly something I'd like to explore. As I said before, adding large language model integration could certainly potentially look across the code base and suggest some terms and definitions. I'm a little hesitant to go too far down that path. One of the real strengths of domain-driven design that I've found is the ability to support collaboration with your domain experts. And I worry that if we give developers a tool to just grab a definition out of a large language model, that will give them more of an excuse to not have to talk to anybody. And I don't think that would actually be in anybody's best interests. So yeah. Intricates is joking, it's fun to see companies not eating their own dog food. You have correctly identified that I do not yet have a Contextive definitions file for Contextive itself. Yes, shame on me. I am adding one. It's actually taken me a little while to work out what the domain terminology I really wanted to use here. I've been refactoring it as we go, but I think I'm at the point now where I can add it, and so I will be adding that very soon. So, but well done you for pointing out that error. So to give you a little tour of what it looks like, it's currently in a monorepo environment. So in the source file, we've got a few key components. There's a core component, which is just a standard F#, fsproj, tests fsproj. Pretty straightforward, just defines the key elements of the YAML file and the deserialization logic and error handling. I should have pointed out at the start here, this is my first F# project. So if anyone's looking at this and going, this is terrible F#, you're probably right. And I would very much appreciate any feedback on how to improve it. But I've certainly enjoyed building it nonetheless. One thing I have also been really focusing on is tests. So I've been following a test-driven development approach. And if I look at the tests here, we've got quite a strong suite of tests, which has been really helpful for that refactoring that I mentioned when I've decided that I need to change the modularization or move code around, think about doing it in different ways. These tests have really come in handy. So that's the core. There's the language server. The language server depends on the OmniSharp library. So I don't know if anyone from OmniSharp is on the call, but huge thank you to that team for building that library, which I think is used in a few projects. And typically the structure here is a handler that interfaces with the C# elements of the OmniSharp project, and then translates into traditional F# handler functions and so on. You may also notice I'm using the PhantomS project for the formatting, so huge thanks to all of the contributors to PhantomS that I heard on the conference earlier today. And there's a lot of stuff in here about how to find the autocompletes and how to do the hovers and so on, things that are really specific to the IDE experience, which is why they're in the language server. The other key component is the VsCode extension, which is a Fable project. So in the source folder, we have a standard fsproj, which is a Fable project. It's pretty lightweight. It basically just interacts with the TypeScript language server client, defines how to run the language server. So in debug, we run it with .NET Run, and in production, we just call the binary that's built, and it just configures and kicks off the language client. But there's a few pieces of middleware and some other things to support multi-root in VsCode, and some supporting utilities there. One thing I do really like about this is the testability. So I've added quite a lot of end-to-end tests, so that use some great testing libraries, Fable Mocha in particular, because that interacts with the Mocha suite. I should have mentioned that the language server tests are written using Unquote and Expecto, two awesome F# libraries for testing. One thing I will show you quickly here, which I quite like, is if we run these tests, you do get, even in VsCode, an experience that looks a lot like if you're running Cypress or Playwright tests in a browser. Wait for this to, hopefully the window pops up on the right screen. Here we go. So we can watch these tests execute. It'll go through, change a bunch of settings, load up some files, validate that it gets the right definitions. And this all runs in GitHub Actions on every commit as well, using a headless browser, which is pretty cool. But the part that is, I think, just done recently to do that Slack bot, which I really like, is in the cloud folder. This is the POC stuff. So this is using AWS CDK. So I don't know how many people are familiar with AWS CDK, but it is a library that you can use to define your infrastructure as code. So what does that mean? If you want to have some Lambda functions, you can call this function. It's all in the Amazon CDK NuGets, which are obviously intended to be used from C#, but absolutely no problems consuming them from F#. So in here, we just basically define an S3 bucket to store the definitions in. We define an event bus, some Lambda function to handle events, such as message received, Lambda function to handle the API, which receives the callback from Slack, and then some permissions management, and a little bit of tweaking to do it depending on whether I'm testing it locally or not, because I'm also using a project called LocalStack, which runs a simulation of AWS within a Docker container locally. So I can do a lot of testing of these Lambdas and the way they interact with many AWS service components right on my machine before I even deploy it. I'll show you a little bit what that looks like, if I can find a thing. Using Fake with Fake Build, which does a number of steps, including publishing the .NET Giraffe project, which handles the API calls, doing a CDK deployment using deploy local, which runs CDK local to do the deployment, which deploys it to LocalStack, which synthesizes the infrastructure into CloudFormation and deploys it. So there's no changes, so I haven't changed anything. And then it runs a bunch of tests against the APIs. And thankfully there with Expecto, we find out that all those tests pass. So that's quite nice. Just looking at the time there, what else can I show you that would be of interest? Yeah, look, I think that's probably running close to time, and I'm very happy to be able to say that I'm not the person to cause the conference to get delayed. So I might just wrap it up there and see if there's any other questions. I know I've answered a few as we've gone, but if anybody else would like to chime in with a question or a request, I'm very happy to take that now. Yep, Jimmy's question about aliases. Yes, there is. It's not currently working in the Slack bot, but it is in the primary extension, so I can show you that. If we had the, well, now we do, since we do have a little bit of time, there was a feature I wanted to show, which was about paths. So if we say we're in the campaign context, we might have another context, which might be, say, a scheduling context, which is all about planning future campaigns. And in this context, the word campaign might have a very different definition. It might be a proposed project or a set of projects to call people. And what Contextive will do, because we've put these paths here, if I create a folder called campaign and move that into it, actually I might make it campaign so I can, and so you see here in this term, in this folder, it gives me the scheduling context, a proposed project or set of projects to call people. If I go into the campaigns folder, it gives me the original campaign context. So this is why it's called Contextive, really, because it's context aware and it gives you the right definitions in the right spot, depending on where you are. All right. Now I'm really running very close to running over time, so I might wrap it up there. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's, I hope you've enjoyed learning about this. Feel free to join me on Twitter. I'm at Chris Simon AU. On Mastodon, Chris Simon AU at hackydome.io. And Contextive is on Twitter, but not yet on Mastodon. It will be soon at Contextive_tech. If you're interested in learning more about domain-driven design, there is this book, Domain Modeling Made Functional, which was referenced earlier. It's pretty cool. Domain-Driven Design Europe is an awesome conference. It's just finished, but it'll be on next year. And they have great talks like DDD and Functional Programming Can't Be Friends Yet by Mike Sperber and Henning Schwenter, which was a very funny thing. So keep an eye out for the video that hopefully is coming soon from that one. Great. Thanks. Now I'll really wrap up.
Thank you very much. This was really exciting, and I was following the YouTube comments. I think it escalated quite quickly because someone said 7 minutes in, I'm convinced, I'll totally have to give this a go. And then towards the end, someone was saying, oh, this looks really cool. I'll have to force my team to use this.
Well, I hope nobody has to get forced to use it. My hope is that it's a pleasure to use by being, so it's really intentionally, it's quite lightweight and it's just easy to layer on top of any existing system. It's very non-prescriptive and non-opinionated about how your code is structured and organized. So hopefully it is easy to add.
And just to answer to the comment from Twitch, we are following Twitch as well.
Yeah.
So we see everything. Well, thanks again for joining us, and it's been amazing to sort of see a talk that's interesting, both because it's implemented in F# and because it's great for F# programmers.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much, and we're glad we didn't have to drag you out of the bed at 2 a.m.
Me too.